This video will cover the first three chapters of book Zeta of Aristotle's Metaphysics. And with this book, we begin to examine the core of the work. In previous books, we saw Aristotle circumscribing the subject matter of philosophy as the science of being qua being. The question, what is being, is a question about what exists. What are the entities that exist? And we've seen that his answer in brief is that substances exist and things that are spoken of substances. Or more exactly, it is substance that exists in a primary way, a way that takes precedence over other things. Other things besides substances may exist, but they exist in a derivative way or in a way that depends upon substances. Aristotle first turns in this book, book Zeta, to the question of which of the many ways in which being is spoken picks out the substances. So we see in Zeta 1, he begins by saying, that which is spoken of in many ways, as we have previously expounded in our discussion of the ways in which things are spoken of. For, on the one hand, it means what something is, and an item with thisness, and on the other, a quality or quantity, or each of the other items that are predicated in this way. This makes a distinction between what something is and an item with thisness. We might say the what, or the this of a thing, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the things that are predicated of this what or this. So you've got the what, the this. You want to point at something when you're saying this. It's that sense that he's trying to convey. The this, this thing here. What it is. There's that existing reality on the one hand, and then there are the various things that are predicated. Clear, wet, a solid semi-cylindrical shape. The things that I would predicate of this thing that I say is a glass. That's what it is. So there's a bifurcation between the this, the what, on the one hand, and the various things that are spoken of or predicated of the this or the what on the other hand. That's the fundamental cleavage in Aristotle's ontology, or his account of being. The first, of course, as we already expect based on what we've covered so far, is going to be associated with the substance or the primary being. The latter is going to be the accidents, the things that we associated earlier with the term per accidents, things that something may or may not have. The accidents of the thing. So you have the substance of the thing, and then you have the accidents of the thing, which are the features of the thing. And these may include things like the quantity of the thing, the various qualities, as the ones I enumerated earlier, the clarity of the material, the cylindrical, semi-cylindrical shape, the solidity, and so on, the various qualities of the thing, the relations in which it stands to other substances. So this thing is holding the water. It's in that relationship to another substance. Obviously, I can't resist temptation. When the water is this close and it's this dry in the desert, I just have to take a sip. So there's the accidents, the quantity, the various qualities, the relations in which it stands to other substances, the actions it performs, the changes it undergoes, the way that it is acted upon or affected by other things, and so forth. In the second paragraph, he says, this is page 167, by the way, in our text, going on to 168. Now, given that that which is spoken of in as many ways as this, it is patently the case that the primary thing that is what something is which picks out the substance. Whenever we say that a given thing is of a certain kind, we say that it is good or bad as it may be, but not that it is 3 feet long or that it is a man. Whereas whenever we say what something is, we do not say that it is white or that it is hot or that it is 3 feet long, but that it is a man or that it is a god. The other items then are said to be things that are, insofar as, given that something is in a certain way, some of them are quantities, some qualities, some affections, and some other such. What the thing is fundamentally, or in the primary sense, is not to be, for example, white or hot or 3 feet long, but it is to be a man or it is to be a god. In other words, the substance that may or may not be white, that may or may not be 3 feet long, that may or may not be hot, is the primary being. That's the substance. Notice the role that grammar is playing in regard to this account of what exists primarily versus what exists secondarily. Aristotle seems to be implying here that since substance is in the subject position grammatically in the sentence, it is to be understood as primary being. Whereas the accidents are those things that are properly spoken of grammatically in the predicate position. Aristotle even seems to go on to argue that there's a certain sense in which actions, states, and dispositions do not really exist at all. That is, they do not exist per se. They cannot exist in themselves. Rather, they exist only as acts, states, dispositions of a substance. So if you read the first paragraph, the first complete paragraph on page 168, he says, now this gives rise to a real puzzle. Are walking and being healthy and sitting, that is, we have an action, walking, a state of being healthy, and a disposition, sitting, are walking, being healthy, and sitting each a thing that is or not? And ditto for all such other cases. For none of them is either something that can exist per se, or that can be separated from substance. Rather, it is the case that if there is anything here that is a thing that is, it is that which is doing the walking, the sitting, or the being healthy. So, a key notion here is the notion of separability, being able to exist as separate. Substances are separable from the actions, states, and dispositions they engage in. So, for example, a particular substance, say, for example, a man, can be walking. The action of walking, however, can be separated from can't be separated from the substance, the man who's doing the walking. There is no just walking without something walking. But the man can be separated from his walking. So the man can start to run. Now he is no longer walking, and in that sense, he's separated from his walking. But he's still, of course, the same man. He still continues to exist. Whereas the walking that he was instantiating previously no longer exists. It couldn't exist in a way that was separate from the substance that it was an action of. And similarly, we can see how this would be the case with states like being healthy. The man is being healthy. That state of health exists in the man, but it's not separable from the man in the same way in which the man can be separated from his health. Because the man, of course, can fall ill, and now he is no longer in that state. That state is no longer connected to him. But nonetheless, the man continues to exist now as a sick man. And the man who was sitting, of course, can stand up. And now that sitting is no longer something that exists. It could not exist except for being in the man. But the man continues to exist, even though he is now standing. So the idea of substances being separable from action states and dispositions is a clue for Aristotle of the superior independence and reality excuse me, of the substance over the actions, dispositions, and states. Now, it still might not be obvious why this difference of separability versus inseparability makes all the difference as far as existence is concerned, privileging substance over the accidents in this way. What reason does Aristotle have for regarding substance as the primary being in this way? And he gives a further explanation at the conclusion of the same paragraph I was just reading from. So he goes on to say, it is things that are doing something in this way that it would seem most plausible to consider things that are, and for the following reason. There is, in this case, something defined that underlies, and it is this which is their substance in particular. Its presence is clearly revealed by the very structure of a predication of this type, and is good, the predicate is good, or sits, the predicate sits, is not applied other than to such an underlying thing. So we get here the notion of an underlying thing, which actually is part of the reason, if not the main reason, that Aristotle's Greek term is translated in Latin as substantia, which becomes our English substance, our anglicized Latin or originated term. Substance is something literally that stands under, underlying or standing under in this sense. Standing under as it were as a support, in the way that a foundation supports a house, for example, or a structure. The view seems to be here that the grammatical subject corresponds to the substance and the accidents to the grammatical predicate, and that what is primary is, in reality, is what is primary in the sentence, and this is the subject. The subject is primary in the sentence. Why? Well, he references the idea of definition here. The subject is, he seems to be saying, the most well-defined part of the sentence. There's no reason to say, of course, that the subject is somehow on a deeper, more underlying level of the sentence. It seems to be a category error sometimes, some kind, to speak of one part of the sentence being underlying another part. Although I suppose there's potentially such a thing as deep grammar or something like that. But Aristotle doesn't seem to be referring to that here. Rather, what he has in mind is that the definition is somehow ultimately anchored or rooted in the subject. And that means not only the definition of the subject, but also the definitions of the predicates, that the predicates have to be understood in relationship to something that is being referred to in the subject. Now, to see what's going on here, we might observe that any noun can potentially function grammatically as a subject. So an action can be a subject of a sentence, a state can be a subject of a sentence. I can say, for example, that walking to the store was invigorating. And what Aristotle has in mind here is that even though walking here, which is, of course, an action, is functioning grammatically as a subject in this particular sentence, that walking to the store was invigorating, in order to define what I mean by that, in order to define what this walking is, I am going to have to, in short order, refer to a substance. So a walk is an act of traveling on foot, right? And another way to put this would be to say, to adequately spell out or explain or clarify what I mean by walking, I have to mention foot, on foot. I have to mention feet. And in order to explain feet, I have to refer to a certain class of organisms that have feet. And organisms would be a paradigm of substances for Aristotle. Ultimately, even though it is the case that actions, dispositions, states can also function grammatically as subjects in the sentence, it's really those things that function grammatically as subjects in the definitions at the most base level that are subjects most properly. That seems to be what you would say here. So properly speaking, it's the the organism in this example that is the subject of my grammatical expression once I spell it out and I define it. So there's this priority of the subject in the proper sense being the base level of a definition that he's assuming or relying on here. Another way to put this would be to say that the substance is the bearer of definitions. To define an act, state, or disposition, you ultimately are going to have to refer to a substance, which is the ultimate bearer of the definition. So that brings us to our first discussion question. It's a large question that we can explore in many different directions. But I want you to ask yourself, does Aristotle have good grounds for privileging what is referenced in the subject position of our speech in this way? Does Aristotle have good grounds for privileging what's referenced in the subject position of our speech in the way I just described? Can you think of any reasons to be skeptical of this philosophical decision? Another way to summarize the question would be to say, what grounds do we have for the assumption that the grammatical structure of our language is a sure guide to the metaphysical structure of reality? What grounds do we have for the assumption, the apparent assumption, that the grammatical structure of our language is a sure guide to the metaphysical structure of reality, such that those things that have this natural place grammatically in the subject position of a sentence are understood also to be primary being or primary substance? Okay, so that's Zeta 1. In Zeta 2, Aristotle turns to the question of what particular things count as substances. And he recognizes that the most obvious answer would seem to be natural or perceptible bodies. Natural or perceptible bodies, or you might say sensible bodies. The concrete, tactile objects of our everyday environment. But even more so than that, those things that seem to have a kind of internal unity, he implicitly privileges. For example, organisms. So the first thing he mentions are the living organisms that seem to be not only a concrete, tactile, perceptible bodies, but also seem to have some kind of internal principle of unity that keeps them together. They're not just merely agglomerations of stuff, but they have some kind of internal cohesion that keeps them going on their own. So they have that being per se, that intrinsic being. So the natural or perceptible organisms could be, or bodies rather, could be classified as, first of all, living organisms. Second, elemental materials, like, of course, the classic 4 elements: fire, water, earth, and air. So living organisms first, second, elemental materials, and then third, compounds from such materials. So things like the clouds, the sun, the ocean, objects, purely material objects of that kind. All of these are, of course, various forms of perceptible bodies. We would naturally refer to them as natural things, empirical objects, There are a lot of names that these things have, but I'm assuming the general idea is clear. And Aristotle thinks this is the natural common sense view about what things count as substances. These sort of empirical objects. And he also immediately acknowledges, after he lays this out, that it's an open-ended empirical question what sorts and how many natural bodies are. That isn't a question for philosophy per se, but rather a question for individual empirical sciences to investigate. For example, how many and what kinds of animals are there? How many and what kinds of plants are there? Even how many and what kinds of elements are there? These are all empirical questions. And it's not the subject matter of metaphysics particularly to investigate those sorts of questions. What is a question for metaphysics, and a controversial question, a highly controversial question, is whether there are other substances that are not apparent to the senses, that are not perceptible by the senses, and hence are not subject to empirical natural scientific investigation. So are there such things as imperceptible substances, super sensible realities, realities that escape the senses but that still have reality? And the two main candidates that have found advocates historically in the history of philosophy are the forms, the Platonic forms, and numbers. So we talked last time about Plato's idea that there are these forms that exist as sort of absolute archetypes of various sorts of things, and that they serve as sort of natural kinds and universals, so that we could talk about the form of tree or treeness as being a kind of natural archetype or even a prototype for all the individual sensible things. And these are modeled by Plato on not just ethical realities like the idea of the good, but also numbers. And that is the other main paradigm for these sort of imperceptible realities that still is much debated today. Are numbers real? Do numbers have a kind of substantial reality? What is the nature of the ontology of numbers? What account do we give of the being of numbers? So Aristotle acknowledges that there is this question about whether the forms exist even though they're not perceptible by the senses, or whether numbers exist even though they're not perceptible by the senses. And there are various reasons and arguments for thinking that these things exist that Aristotle doesn't mention here, so we won't go into them. He seems here to be mainly just sort of staking out the terrain here. Separating out the paradigm case of what counts as a substance, namely empirical objects, and then acknowledging that there also exists at least a question about whether some kinds of non-empirical objects, such as the forms and numbers, might also have a substantial reality, and whether there's a question whether we can establish this through philosophical argument or not. Okay, so he thinks that to answer this question, or at least this seems to be his basic assumption here, it's going to be necessary, or at least helpful, to backtrack to the question of what substance is in general. What substance is in general. So chapter 2 is dealing with this question of what counts as a substance, what kinds of things are substances and what kinds of things aren't, what is included in this set or class of the substantial things. But to answer this question, at least insofar as we're concerned with the possibility of non-perceptible substances, non-empirical substances, it's necessary to ask what substance is in general. So that is what he's going to turn to beginning in chapter 3. But before we turn to that, I want to raise the second discussion question, and this is a quite general discussion question. It's another one of these questions that is not intended to have a correct answer so much as it is a method for basically doing an inventory on your own pre-philosophical assumptions and inclinations, tendencies. And the question is this: do you believe that there are any good reasons to suppose that there are substances that are imperceptible to the five senses? Do you believe that there are any good reasons to suppose that there are substances that are imperceptible to the five senses? Do numbers or abstract entities such as kinds, sets, classes, or universals exist, in your opinion? Are you inclined to believe that such things must have an independent existence, and if so, why? What about spiritual entities such as minds? Do they exist? Are they perceptible? Are these perceptible entities? Why or why not? Do we perceive minds? So think of things that might be plausibly thought in your view or your opinion to be both imperceptible and yet also have a kind of substantial reality. And think about what reasons there might be for supposing that such things exist. Okay, so again, second discussion question is, are there any good reasons to suppose that there are substances that are imperceptible to the five senses? This brings us to chapter 3. In Zeta 3, Aristotle is asking about the causes of substance. And cause here means what makes a substance a substance. What makes a substance a substance? Now that locution, what makes a substance a substance, seems rather ambiguous given the fourfold nature of the causes according to Aristotle. And I'll refer you to the first video in this series where we talked about those. Now, in this context, the main ambiguity that we need to be aware of is that, on the one hand, we naturally tend to think of the cause of a thing in terms of what produced it. The efficient cause would be the closest Aristotelian notion of cause. So we think of the cause as what produced the thing. You know, the cause of this book was a printing press somewhere or what have you. The cause of this glass was a factory that included various machinery for producing glass and so forth. What produced it? You know, if we ask what's the cause, we say what produced it. And that's been the main way, I think, which we've been thinking about this question of the cause of substance. But here, in this chapter of Zeta, Aristotle seems to be thinking more of something like the formal criteria for something being a thing of a certain type. The formal criteria for something being a thing of a certain type. So you might think, for example, of the criteria of being a woman. The American Cancer Society recently has been criticized for using the phrase individuals with a cervix rather than the phrase woman. Previously, having a cervix was criterial for being a woman. It was at least sufficient. Or having a sort of anatomy where, barring some, of course, illness or accident, you would have had a cervix in the normal course of things. Having a cervix, in this sense, is normally considered sufficient to make you a woman, and also necessary to make you a woman. So it wasn't necessary to use a phrase like individuals with a cervix. But of course, in this sense, having a cervix isn't the same as producing a woman. It's absurd to think, of course, that the cervix is what made the woman in the sense of produced the woman, as if you sprang from your cervix if you're a woman. So it's being viewed here as criteria for being a woman. And of course, in using the term individual with a cervix instead of woman, the American Cancer Society is assuming that there's some other criteria that having for being a woman, that having a cervix is not necessary for being a woman, and so you can't just refer to cervical cancer being a problem for women per se, but it's only a problem for women who have a cervix, and that's the source of the controversy, of course, is what is the criteria for being a woman in the 21st century. Okay, but we don't need to get into that question, thankfully. We're just dealing with the idea of cause that he's operating with here. So it's what makes a substance, but in this criterial sense, in the sense in which someone at one point in time might have uncontroversially thought that to have a cervix is necessary for being a woman. He's interested in this question. And of course, there's two ways in which this can go. We can talk about what's necessary for something being a substance, and also what's sufficient for something being a substance. What is the something without which something doesn't have the status of substantiality, and what is something that if the thing has it, it automatically has the status of substantiality. Those are the senses of cause and the sense of making something a substance that Aristotle is dealing with here. Now, he lays out quite clearly 4 causes, and it's clearly laid out here on page 174, so I won't need to write it down again or anything like that. He says 4 potential causes of substance that he's going to be considering here. He says, first of all, A, that which it was to be that thing. B, the universal. C, the genus. And 4th, the subject. So it's in each one of these cases, it's rather an awkward locution in English to talk about that which it was to be the thing being the cause of the substance, or the universal being the cause of the substance, or the genus being the cause of the substance, or the subject being the cause of the substance. But if you translate this in terms of, for example, the universal being that which makes the substance a substance, it gets a little bit clearer. And he's going to go on to discuss these other examples later on, so we'll table those for now. In chapter 3, what he's concerned with is only the last of these, the subject. And the idea here then is going to be that what makes a certain something, call it X, into a substance is the subject that it is predicated of. What makes a certain X into a substance is the subject that it is predicated of. So this, of course, goes along very nicely with this idea that we're associating the substance with the grammatical subject of the sentence. What makes something into a substance is the subject that it's predicated of. So what is the subject? And here he considers 4 possibilities, either matter or form or a composite or compound of both matter and form. The subject could be either matter, it could be form, or it could be a composite of matter and form. And once again, of these 3 possibilities, he considers just one in this chapter, and so we table the other 2. Here, what he's going to consider as a possibility is the idea that the subject of all predicates seems to fit matter most of all. The subject of all predicates seems to fit matter most of all. In other words, it's the matter that is most naturally thought of as the subject. The matter is that of which things are predicated. That's the idea. And therefore, that the matter would be the cause of the substance. What makes the substance, having matter. Okay. Now, this idea of matter that he's operating with here has become known in the history of Western philosophy as prime matter or primary matter. And he lays out what he's referring to here. I'm going to quote a long passage on page 175, which essentially defines the notion of matter that he's operating with here, this notion of a primary or a prime matter. So here's the quote. This begins in the 3rd paragraph on page 175. It's 1029A in the Becker numbers. He says, if you extract all other features of the object, what is revealed as being left over? After all, the features of bodies are affections, qualities, and capacities, and in particular, its 3 spatial dimensions are kinds of quantity and not substances. And it is rather that which is the primary subject of all these, which is a substance. So the The idea is that the substance is going to be not the abstracted features of the object, such as the way in which it's affected, whether it's burnt or whether it's fresh or whatever ways it's affected. It's not going to be the qualities of being white or hot. It's not going to be the quantity for how large or how small it is, but rather it's going to be what's left over when you abstract from all of these. Because all of these are the things that's predicated of the subject. So you're going to get down to what makes the thing a substance only once you abstract from all of these qualities, quantity, affections, and so forth. So he continues. If then we further remove the three spatial dimensions, so we're removing here not just the qualitative features of something, for example, its color, but we're also even removing its spatial dimensions, its shape, right? If it's humanoid, we're abstracting from that. And we're saying, well, what makes this a substance, what makes this man a substance is not its humanoid shape even, or any of the other qualities that, as it were, fill in the humanoid shape, but it's something that remains over once we abstract from this. So if then we further remove the three spatial dimensions, we find nothing left over, unless just what is delimited by these dimensions is something. But this means that if we adopt this approach, it has to turn out that matter stands revealed as the only substance. He goes on to say, let me be quite clear about what I mean here by matter. I mean an item that is not in itself a something, and is also not a quantity, nor said to be of any of these other things by which that is defined. For there is something that is the subject and the predication of each of these others, and being is different for this than for each of the categories. So for that very last item will not in itself be a something, nor a quantity, nor anything in any of the other categories. Right? So whatever this prime matter is, it's not going to be something that's in any of the other categories. It's not going to be a quality. It's not going to be a quantity. It's not going to be, even the spatial dimensions. It's not going to have spatial dimensions. It can't be said to be of such and such volume, for example, or such and such height, because we're abstracting from all of these predicates. And what's left over is what we're talking about when we're talking about matter, in this sense. And this is what, as I said, has gone in the tradition by the name prime matter or primary matter. So he continues then, if we start from these assumptions, it has to turn out that it is matter that is substance. And yet, this just cannot be so. So what we've arrived at can't possibly be substance or the cause of substance. And this is because surely what we really think to be the most central features of substance surely are separability and thisness. Separability, we already talked about this idea of separability being, now we can say a criterion, Aristotle would say a cause of substantiality. Separateness and thisness. And this has come up as well in the original distinction that he drew between substance and accidents. We talked about the thisness, the whatness and the thisness. The idea that you can point to this and say, this is a substance, right? Or this is a substance, or this is a substance. The thisness and the separability are the central features of substance. And the problem is that matter, prime matter in this sense that we've just described, doesn't have thisness. How would you point to the prime matter of a man? Well, of course, you want to point to the man who's standing at that location, occupying that amount of space. But remember, we've abstracted from these qualities. We've abstracted from the humanoid shape and the volume and the height. And there's nothing of that left over when we're talking about the man. Right? That man is gone completely. And in fact, we have to say that prime matter, so described, what we've arrived at when we abstract from all of these qualities and all of these accidents that can be predicated of the subject, what we've arrived at seems to be intrinsically nothing. What's left over is just nothing at all. But of course, that's the very opposite of being, and that's what we're supposed to be describing. We're supposed to be describing being. Substance was supposed to be the paradigm of being. And so matter as the cause of substance can't be nothing. That would make nothing the cause of being, which is, of course, absurd. So we can summarize this by saying that Aristotle's problem with matter as an adequate answer to the question, what makes up the substance, or what causes the substance, in the sense of what's the criteria, the necessary and sufficient criteria of substance. Matter is an inadequate answer, rather, to that question, because it flouts two of the other conditions of being a substance, namely being a thisness, and being separate. Being a this and being separate from other things. So that's the problem that we're confronting here. Okay. Now this leads us then to our third and final discussion question. Are these two criteria, thisness and separability, truly necessary and or sufficient for making something a substance? Are these two criteria of thisness and separability truly necessary and sufficient for making something a substance? Are they adequate criteria of substantiality? Can we do without them? Why or why not? And so we're moving beyond then what might be, in some sense, perhaps the most natural or most commonsensical idea of what the cause of substance is, or what makes something a substance, namely the matter of the thing, of which its various qualities are predicated. Because it turns out that matter, once we abstract all the accidents, all the predicates from the substance, leaves nothing over, and is just a kind of indeterminate nothing that lacks thisness and separate individual existence. And so we need to turn to the other possibilities. And remember, the other possibilities are form, or either form or composite of matter and form, a compound of matter and form. And those are the possibilities that Aristotle is going to go on to consider in further chapters of Zeta and subsequent books of the Metaphysics.